Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by the U.S. holiday, the 4th of July. Remember, Independence Day isn't just for getting drunk and blowing things up. You can do that sober as well. Episode 241, a showdown between Redux Toolkit versus MobX-State-Tree.
Did you know that we got nominated for an award for this podcast?
I heard about that. Yeah.
Actually, you told me, Robin.
I did tell you.
Let's just not feign ignorance here. It was in my personal email, and I don't really look at that as often.
Yeah, I informed Jamon that we had been nominated for an award.
This podcast was, and I'm. It actually was like kind of validating. I guess I get these emails that are like, oh, you've been nominated for an award. Just go to this website, pay us money, and then we'll put you on.
We had to make sure it wasn't a scam.
Oh, the token Nigerian prince.
Hey, Mazen can say that because he's Nigerian. Like, he originally is from Nigeria, okay? People, relax.
Somewhere in Nigeria, there's an apartment full of money that no one's claimed. So
someone's just waiting. Like, why does no one want this money?
Right? Yeah. But in this case, it was, I think, legit. And it actually is legit because Gant said that he's actually handed this award out before at React. Used to be React Amsterdam. Yeah, of course he did.
Of course he has.
It's now React Summit, but the award is Most Impactful Contribution to the Community.
This is for the React Open Source Awards 2022.
I mean, who are the other nominees?
We don't know.
We don't know. Nobody as good as us.
I was going to say, spam their Twitter. Like, we should win
Maybe
this.
we're the only nominee.
We'll find out on...
That would be one way to win it. Is to be the only nominee.
That's like whenever we have an election, like half the ballot is like one candidate unopposed. Like that's just like a shoo-in.
Exactly. You know what I do in those elections? Because generally I don't know anything about these like local races.
Yeah.
You know, I actually don't vote for
the unopposed
one
people?
person, just in case like there's some.
I always read the pamphlet. Like I read their blurb, I look into them, and if they're like
okay-ish, then you
decent,
vote for
then I vote for them. But
my thought process is like if there's someone who's deserving of a write-in, they have a better chance if I don't vote for the. I don't know. It's a dumb way to vote, I think. Whatever. But other than stuffing the ballot box, I don't know. We just have to wait, I guess, and see if we win this award.
This episode will probably come out after the conference.
Yeah, it will. That's true.
But if you happen to be listening to this as a time traveler
and you're on the committee,
get tickets to React Summit.
Yeah, if you're on the committee that's deciding, I mean, you know where to find us and we can arrange something.
It's on June 17th. You can fly. I think all of the in-person tickets are sold out. So, but there's a virtual option, which is still, I think, infinitely available.
You know, if we win this, then I can add award winning to our intro.
Ooh.
Yes. And all over the website. Did you know I helped Justin go through the website yesterday, and I made sure the podcast was highlighted.
Prominent.
Yes.
As it should be.
That's awesome. We need all the advertising we can get. Well, I think that is actually pretty exciting and a testament, by the way, to obviously all the people that helped make this possible, but also to the listeners. Really appreciate all of you being here, hanging out with us.
Don't be shy, too. We love it. We love hearing from people who love the podcast.
We do. And we don't hear enough, even though we know you're out there. I see the statistics. This is getting downloaded and listened to.
But we get like one DM every couple weeks. So yeah, shower us with more praise, please.
You can see what our love language is here. We like awards over praise.
Words of affirmation.
So I'm Jamon Holmgren, your host and friendly CTO of Infinite Red. I am located in the Pacific Northwest in Vancouver, Washington. No, I'm not Canadian. No, I'm not in Washington, D.C. And I live there with my wife and 4 kids on 3 acres. I actually got my tractor out the other day and the battery was dead. So I had to jumpstart it. But yeah, I'm starting that process of cleaning things up for the summer. I'm joined today by my inconceivable co-hosts, Robin and Mazen. Inconceivable. Yes, that's, I guess, yeah, you're inconceivable in some fashion. Robin is a senior software engineer at Infinite Red. She's located west of Portland, Oregon with her husband and 2 kids and has specialized in React Native for the past 5 or 6 years, something like that. Mazen lives in Durham, North Carolina with his wife and little boy. He's a former pro soccer player and coach and is a senior React Native engineer also here at Infinite Red. This episode is sponsored by Infinite Red. Infinite Red is a premier React Native design and development agency located fully remote in the US and Canada. By the way, Robin, you did a good job reading this in the episode. I actually listened to the one that had just come out before we recorded this, and you both did a great job.
I listened to a lot of NPR podcasts.
Yeah. It's just like, I should have you read this, really. If you're looking for React Native expertise for your next React Native project, hit us up. Why do I say React Native like every 3 seconds?
You also say Infinite Red every 3 seconds. If there's ever a drinking game, if anybody is playing a drinking game during the podcast, every time we say Infinite Red and React Native,
they'll be very drunk before we even get started.
They won't even know what the topic's on.
On the floor.
I know. That may be actually the way to go. It's probably the easiest way to become award-winning is to just get everybody drunk. Where was I? Doesn't matter. We're the React Native Radio podcast. All right, let's move on. Let's get into our topic. We have actually a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It could ruffle some feathers. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it could?
I think so.
I mean, it's always a divisive topic. No matter how many times it's been debated.
Programmers are weird.
It's still divisive.
It's true.
It's a very opinionated topic, I would say. I think everyone has their opinion and they barricade themselves behind it.
Well, because it's like Flutter versus React Native. It's something that you spend a huge portion of your time using. So yeah, you get entrenched. True. And when someone questions your choices, then it sort of gets at you.
It's a personal attack.
Yeah.
So the topic is Redux Toolkit versus MobX-State-Tree Showdown. Now, before we start, I should say I do need to put out a disclaimer. I think it's important to note the conflict of interest here. I am the primary maintainer, for better or worse, of MobX-State-Tree.
How much time would you say you spend maintaining that there, Jamon?
Let's move on. I don't claim
it doesn't
to be
need
unbiased.
A lot of it. It's fine. It's done. It's built. It works. It's stable.
We'll actually talk about that a little bit a little later. We also use MobX-State-Tree in our Ignite boilerplate. So we've been using it at Infinite Red where we can for the past, 5 years, something like that.
So we don't claim to be unbiased.
Not at all.
No.
However, we have spent, Mazen and I did spend the past year on a project using Redux Toolkit for a client who determined they chose the stack. So they decided on Redux Toolkit. So we used Redux Toolkit for a year. So we have used it on a daily basis.
In depth.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, very in depth. And it's nice to transition to it because I'd heard a lot about it. And I think it come out not long ago-ish.
Mm-hmm.
We used it in depth, through this app, and this app's in production now and it's great. So having that extra context behind all the other stuff we've used, I think was very helpful.
It's really nice to know a lot about both.
It's like know your competitor.
Absolutely. We did an episode on state management before. We did talk a lot of MobX-State-Tree then as well. And that was in actually our second episode after we took over React Native Radio 175. So go check that out if you want to hear us opine about it prior to this. One last note before we get started. We're not going to cover Redux Toolkit Query, RTK Query. That is part of RTK, so I should mention it. It is sort of a competitor to React Query, and but it's a little outside of the scope of what we're trying to do here, which is more the state management, the local state management. I would like to do a little bit of maybe do an episode on RTK Query versus React Query versus other options, but we're going to have plenty to go over in this one too. It's probably going to be kind of a long one. All right, so you mentioned that you've used Redux Toolkit. Robin, what else have you used for state management systems so far?
Well, Infinite Red used old school Redux when I first started learning React Native with the help of Redux Sauce, which is a package that we produced.
Yeah, we actually created that.
Yeah, we created Redux Sauce, which took away some of the boilerplate of traditional Redux. I also did one client project where it was truly old school Redux, no no helpers, no anything. And then of course I've used MobX-State-Tree and now Redux Toolkit, and I've also just used context and internal state in React.
Yeah, those are kind of the usual suspects there. So you've gotten the whole gamut. Mazen, what about you?
I've used kind of plain old Redux at one point, Redux Toolkit, use context in some regards, MobX-State-Tree. And I also, I guess I could kind of throw this in here. I did use React Query as a replacement for state management. That was more of like a not playground. The app actually did go to production with it. And it was just kind of good to see how that happened. And it was leveraging GraphQL. So I guess you could say, what's it called? Stateless, but state management less using a different tool.
Yeah. So you kind of rely on the server's state, I guess, more.
And the caching. It was more it was more of a web app where the user's machine learning would run its stuff kind of overnight, and then at like 8 a.m. the data was ready. So at 8 a.m., if it was past 8 a.m. you haven't fetched your data, it would refetch, and there's no need to refetch after that. So
because it's not going to update.
Yeah,
that's an interesting use case.
Yeah, so that's when I was like, you know what? Maybe there's no point in adding all this extra fluff.
And that's a totally valid way to go. For me, I've used a bit of Redux. I didn't do a lot of Redux back when we used to use it because my job was different. At that time, I was running operations more so than being in the tech. I actually became CTO later at Infinite Red. I've, of course, used MobX-State-Tree a lot because I've shifted more into our tech stack once we switched over. I have used MobX by itself some, which has been very interesting to dive into that. And we will, by the way, talk about differences between some of these things. We're not going to go too in depth with this, but just to kind of give people an idea of what we're talking about. And I have built things with useState, useReducer, useContext as well. And I even built my own little thing. It was kind of on top of MobX and MobX React, but it was using, I had a Firestore app. So using Firestore to kind of control a lot of the state on the server side. So yeah, we have a fair amount of experience here, I would say, across the gamut of this. High level Redux is like MobX. This isn't a perfect analogy.
It's an analogy.
Yeah. And Redux Toolkit is like MobX-State-Tree. Yeah. So, Redux itself.
One is like the base and one is like the flavor on top.
And I would say Redux is probably halfway between MobX and MobX-State-Tree. And Redux Toolkit is a bit beyond MobX-State-Tree because it includes the query part of it too. But that's kind of like the scale we're talking about. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, we're going to be talking about Redux Toolkit minus the query part versus MobX-State-Tree. Let's talk about RTK first, and let's talk about kind of the pros, cons, what it does, overview it, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So if you're using Redux Toolkit, the general flow of data looks like you have a store, a primary top-level store, and then you have what are called slices. So like small chunks of your store that sort of compartmentalize your state into business areas, feature areas. And then in your views, you can select state from your stores and you can dispatch actions which change the state in the store. And then you can also utilize a secondary library, Thunk or Sagas, I think, are the two primary.
Redux Sagas, we used to use that as well.
Yeah. Redux Saga and Redux Thunk, which will fetch data from external sources, APIs, what have you. And then your store or your slice will listen for those actions to complete and update state as necessary. And then you can also dispatch those thunks directly from your views as well.
This is just, again, this is kind of my biases coming out, but when I listen to that, I'm just hearing lots of concepts that if you haven't used Redux, you have to learn.
What's a slice? What's a thunk? What does dispatch mean? What's an action? Yeah, it's true.
Selectors.
What's a selector?
All this stuff. And it's like they make up their own terms for all these things. But one of the things that is pretty cool about it is that it, like once you get over the hump of all of those things, then scaling up your state management across a big app is just using all of those concepts over and over and over and over and over.
One quick note, like kind of going over what Robin said, if you're using Redux, kind of linking it to Redux Toolkit here just so you kind of get the full lay of the land. If you're using Redux, you'd remember stuff like actions.type. And that's kind of how things essentially listened to whenever there was a change.
Mm-hmm.
And then the reducers would then go and update the data. The difference here with Redux Toolkit is your overarching slice. Think of it as like a dot then chaining, kind of like how you would chain a promise.
Mm-hmm.
Something very similar to that, where you would have your state, and then you'd have reducers. And then within those reducers, that's where it's listening to your API, your thunks or sagas. And whenever that changes, that's where you would make your update. So we're going away from what would be a switch statement to something within almost like a chain within the slice.
So the API is different. The ergonomics are different even.
Yeah.
Of
It
how
feels,
you approach
I will
it.
say it feels very different
Agreed.
using Redux Toolkit than it did using plain Redux. Other than the terms kind of being the same, I couldn't have told you I was using the same state management library.
Yeah, interesting. And of course, they were trying to address a lot of the concerns and criticisms of Redux, which was too much boilerplate primarily.
There still is quite a lot of boilerplate. It's less.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely has been reduced, but there still is. You still have to remember all the different places you need to make a change in order to do one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, say I want to keep track of a new piece of data.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember the 3 or 4 different places you need to go make a change in order to complete that chain of fetch, update, store. There's a lot of places.
Yeah, I remember with Redux always forgetting, whether it was the action type and it never listening to it and stuff like that. There was just a lot to copy over back and forth. And given that they've kind of improved on it, it's still pretty much the same. Like if you're working on a new app or you're creating a new store, let's say, slice in this concept, you're still bringing over a lot of boilerplate stuff, but it's simplified where instead of over multiple files, you almost could be in one file per store.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, everything was kind of just split up. Now you could say everything is in one, as far as the state management part of things, all in one file. Yet it's still, could be a larger file for you.
It could be 3-4 places within that file.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. And that all those splitting up into multiple files are pretty much in one file spread across the entire file.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the pros of Redux and RTK to start with, because we're really comparing a lot of these things back and forth between MobX-State-Tree and Redux RTK. So first off, they're very popular. It's the most
hugely popular.
The most popular state management library for React.
Yeah. Almost the default choice.
Yeah, just about.
Everyone would probably expect you to be using one of those before even using a new one or a different one.
And that obviously comes with advantages. I mean, it's all over Stack Overflow. It's all over there's so much support. There's so much. The documentation is great. There's
blog posts.
Blog posts, articles.
Yeah.
There's a ton of learning resources and support for when you have issues. Big
community. And these are things that we actually argued were in favor of React Native compared to Flutter. The big community, the ability to hire for it, things like that. So there is a lot that you could say is going for it. I would say their documentation is very, very good, if not great. They've definitely put a ton of time into it. Excellent documentation. Also very good integration with dev tooling. These are really, really important.
You'll find VS Code extensions.
Mm-hmm.
I do kind of going back to the documentation, that every aspect of the documentation, if you're looking for a certain piece of it, has, simple examples of how to do it in both TypeScript and JavaScript. I think that toggle, I think we still forget that a lot of people still use JavaScript. So I think they've put a lot of effort into making sure the documentation
widely
covers
accessible.
all. Yeah, there we go. Widely
and
accessible.
Just defaulting to only JavaScript leaves out the TypeScript side of it.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Very good TypeScript support, actually. I remember that being one of the things.
Yeah, and things generally work pretty well. You don't have a lot of weird errors and stuff.
If you've follow the documentation and you understand the terminology and you're implementing it as expected, it's pretty rare to get some just like funky error that you have to Google and spend a lot of time debugging.
Let's talk about the cons.
So we've touched on some already. Like there still is a lot of boilerplate, despite the fact that it's less boilerplate than there was before. And we've also talked about the all the new sort of conceptual things: reducers, slices, selectors, thunks, sagas,
actions.
Yeah, all these terms that don't necessarily match any mental model that you would already have.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of selectors, so I was actually meeting with a friend, a developer who wants to convert over a pretty large Redux-powered app over to MobX-State-Tree. So he was just asking me a bunch of questions. And he showed me a file that was a 1,400 line selectors file.
Oh my God.
Wow.
This was just one of their many files that had selectors in it. And I just made a comment as we were kind of sliding through it. I said, yeah, you just delete this file and not replace it when you use MobX-State-Tree. So this was one of those things that is just, I guess I'm going to skip ahead actually in my notes here to performance, because that's why selectors exist, is because you don't need every piece of data in every component. So when you have a global store like this and you're passing it around, you need to make sure that it's, performantly selecting only the stuff that you need. Unfortunately, you have to do that manually in Redux and RTK.
Selectors break my brain too.
Yeah.
Like the way they're defined, it's like a function which then passes its return value to a new function, and you have to keep track of like what arguments each function needs, and it's confusing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And slices also, I would say, and this kind of goes to one of my main criticisms of Redux. It's like, because they have made certain trade-off decisions, they're like, okay, we're going to have one big store. Now people want to divide this up into, they don't want everything in one store. So now how do you effectively design a store that can kind of like isolate pieces?
You call it a slice.
Invent a new concept. Like every time it's inventing a new concept.
It's still a store, but we're calling it a slice.
Exactly. And I kind of get why they're calling it a slice, but it's sort of like thinking in terms of the implementation rather than how people would mentally model this stuff. That's just, definitely one of my criticisms. Thunks and sagas are, first off, why are they called thunks and sagas? You don't know what that means.
Saga, I can kind of picture why it's called a saga. I can work it out.
Yeah.
Thunk, no idea.
I guess so.
Absolutely no idea why it's called a thunk.
I will say they're easier to Google.
Yes.
It is true.
Yeah. It's true. They are easier to Google.
So that is a piece of this. And then actions. So both MobX-State-Tree and Redux have actions.
Action is reasonably self-explanatory.
Action is reasonable. Yeah. Now, one of the pieces of this also is that Redux tries very, 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 very hard to be immutable, like all the way through, which forces you to do a bunch of backflips to do anything. Of course, I'm actually not a immutable maximalist. If you've followed me at all, I think immutability has its place, but JavaScript is mutable by default for a reason. And we can talk about that some more, but people will, I guarantee you some people, including some very senior developers who are listening to this right now, will have a visceral reaction to me saying mutability is not bad. They'll be like, oh, no, you can't do that. That's a recipe for disaster.
Everyone has a story of some horrible bug.
Yeah, supposedly.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into that. I could do a whole episode on mutability versus immutability. But Redux has kind of bought into that. Man, I'm really trying not to be too negative here. I'm really trying. Redux has really decided to make the trade-off that immutable everything is the way to go. Now, in RTK, they use immer, and that makes things feel a lot better while still being immutable.
You saying like you're trying not to be biased here, Jamon. I think we're just pointing out the new concepts. Mm-hmm. There are a lot, right? And given that Rob and I had the first-hand experience with it, I think the best thing for anyone to do, especially when maybe this is something to say at the end of the episode also, but do a simple app with both of these, for example, and then try it out for yourself. Get Ignite, get used to MobX-State-Tree and how it's fetching data, and then maybe convert Ignite over to Redux Toolkit and just see the difference for yourself.
It could come down to personal preference too. Like
Exactly.
This isn't an entirely objective thing. Like
No, it's
what's
not.
best for one person in one app could be different than what's best for another person in another app.
Well, like we talked about in the Flutter versus React Native thing, a lot of it comes down to the trade-offs that you make, the trade-offs that you decide, and also better isn't always better because there are different things that apply to this. But coming back to Redux, so I can keep on, so I can keep talking about this. It also subscribes very much to the Flux pattern. Now, Flux came out. I remember when Flux came out, and the initial, first off, it was just sort of a concept. There wasn't even a library. And then there was like a Flux library. There's one called Reflux, which was like the worst name ever.
Reflux. I remember that.
And it was terrible. I shouldn't say it's terrible. The name was terrible. And it also was kind of clunky. Redux came out and actually simplified it quite a lot, which shows you how complicated the Flux pattern was to start with. I sort of feel like the Flux pattern is like programmer egghead brain kind of gone wrong. Like there, you let the PhDs have a little too much freedom here. And all these concepts, instead of like real world people sitting down and building apps.
So can you give everyone just a quick TLDR of what the Flux pattern is if they don't know?
So part of the problem here, like, it's actually difficult for me to even explain, even though I've studied it actually fairly a lot.
That's how complicated it is.
But I'll try. Okay. So the idea behind it was essentially that the more your app grows, the more complex kind of the different pieces that are reaching into your app as far as like state management are concerned. And you have like data being updated from different places in different ways. And, it's sort of like a bidirectional data flow. You have data coming from components and then to components.
The view updates the store and then gets data from, it also gets data from the store.
The view.
Yeah, and the store updates the view. Yeah.
And that was common with Angular and Ember to some degree and things like that. Flux tries to solve this by making it unidirectional,
which is why you have actions and dispatchers and
yeah, exactly. You have kind of like this the classic circle where you have a user interaction hits, you have your action creators that then make an action.
Oh my gosh.
And then that hits a dispatcher.
I had forgotten about action. You had to keep track of your actions and your action creators.
Yeah. And then you have your store, and then once your store updates, then you have change events that hit. Yes. And then those finally go to the React views. It was an interesting idea. It was based off of Elm, and I did some Elm. So like I'm familiar with this pattern. Elm had to do this because there was literally like the language forces you to do something like this. And that's okay. Like I didn't mind it. Anyway, let's not get too deep in the weeds with that, but it kind of gives you a sense. Now, Redux actually made this simpler. It like simplified some of the concepts down, skipped some steps, made it a little easier. So everybody that's why it won. Because the React team was saying you need to use the Flux pattern, and the easiest library to use the Flux pattern was Redux. Mm-hmm. Now, with that said, there were some other ideas out there. Certainly observables and reactive programming were out there, but people were sort of a little scared of it because, again, the egghead sort of got too much control over that part of it as well. And there wasn't really an easy way to do this. So I should mention before we get into MobX-State-Tree, one last thing too, performance. It's actually pretty easy to write poor performing RTK code.
Yes, it's very easy.
And you end up writing code to fix that issue through selectors and some other things. And I think that this is actually, for me, one of the biggest criticisms I have of Redux, as well as one of the biggest places I love having MobX and MobX-State-Tree. So let's get into MobX-State-Tree. And I do want to really quickly, when we're done with this, go back and briefly touch on the pros again of Redux, because there were some really important things in the pros section that we shouldn't forget. The cons sound really bad, but there were some good things. But let's talk MobX-State-Tree. So MobX-State-Tree, you load your data and you can have essentially a function, a method, I guess, in your store.
Well, so yeah, let's start with, first of all, you have stores. That's like the
Correct.
fundamental.
Yeah. Okay, let me back up. Yeah. You have stores. You can have multiple stores. A store instance, you could have 5,000 store instances if you want. A store instance is literally just a model that contains other models. We just call it a store by convention, but you actually define it using types.model. So a store is just a model. Models can be any data model of custom types, or even like types.string, types.number, or it can be a custom type that's an object that contains other things.
It's very OOO reminiscent.
It is actually object-oriented, kind of focused.
It constantly reminds me of Rails, an active record.
Yeah, maybe that's why I like it.
Yeah. From the very beginning, when I first learned about it, I was like, oh, this seems like active record. It still reminds me of active record.
Totally. Then you can pull that data into your store, and then in your components, if you're using MobX React, which is one of the coolest libraries ever, it just watches whatever you're accessing. You don't have to write a selector, you just use it. You go like user.name, and it now knows anytime that name changes in your user model.
But only name. It doesn't
only name.
It doesn't listen for the entire store. It only listens to what you have used.
That's it.
So if email changes, it doesn't care. And I think that's
where you get the performance benefit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like we're jumping ahead to the benefits of it, but it's like, even when you're just using it, for one thing, it's very concise. Actually, let's go ahead and jump into that. We have some other things to talk about here, but let's jump into the pros. I think it's fairly easy to learn. Like I put out a video and like a MobX-State-Tree in 20 minutes thing. And, if you watch that video, you're going to understand like how to use it pretty well. There are a couple other concepts I didn't touch on, but for the most part, the API service is not that big. It's a relatively tight API surface.
All of the sort of side effects, the async actions, like accessing external services, that kind of thing, it's all built in. You're not dealing with a separate, like Sagas and Thunks are a completely separate library to Redux. But with MobX-State-Tree, it's all built in. Your models have their properties, they have their actions. It's all defined directly on your model.
Yeah, if you want to kick off an action that fetches data and updates the store, you just make it an async action, just by literally putting the word async in front of it.
Right. It's just
it's a function.
It's a function.
It's just a function. Like there's no other concepts to learn here. It's just a function.
I think you just mentioned it's just a function, no new concepts. I think that's that, and also the fact that it's less boilerplate, where you don't have to set up all that boilerplate to get it set up. I think it's amazing. It's just small, and you only, set up what you want for that store. And if it's, one function, that's it. That's all you need to do. A view, maybe not even something listening to an API per se.
And like the example I mentioned before, where you're just trying to add a new piece of data that you want to track. In Redux, it would be like 3 or 4 different places that you then have to go update to like add all the links to the chain. And MobX-State-Tree, if I want to add a new property, I add a new property, and then
one line.
I call it in my view.
You just, So if you wanted to add in this hypothetical user model, if you wanted to add an age, you would just put age : number.
Yeah.
And then over in your component where you're consuming the user, you would just do user.age, and you have it. And it's observed, it's selected, it's everything's good to go. And I think that the concepts are a little more universal. Like we're not making up concepts here. There's models and stores. People understand what those are. In fact, we combine them so that they're just one thing.
I think store is actually just a concept that Infinite Red invented.
Sort of like, I guess
we just name our models specifically like something store if it's going to contain a list of other
other stuff. So like if you have a messages store, it'll have many messages.
Right, exactly.
In it. Yeah.
Which is, again, it harkens back to Active Record for me, because you have tables full of records. And so each record is a model, and then you have a table which stores a list of them. And so we have our like instance models, and then we'll have store models, which then store an array of those instances. It's very databasey.
A few other things that you can do is runtime types. So this is only during development unless you want it in prod, but during development, you can have MobX-State-Tree check to make sure that the types.number that you are now setting, age equals 40, you actually gave it a number and not a string or some other thing. So runtime type checking, less important when you have TypeScript. The nice thing is that it infers the TypeScript types from those runtime types. So you don't have to do it twice. You just do it once and you're good. You obviously have your actions. You can do regular, which are just like, make this change to the store, like set current user to a new user.
Right. You usually make a bunch of like setter
actions. Exactly. You have async actions. So async action was just, like I said, you just put the word async in front of your function name and now it's async and you can await. And then you have flows. And flows are really basically almost identical to the async actions, but the reason that they exist is because...
Generators, aren't they?
They are generators. The reason that they exist is because in MobX-State-Tree, you can only update your store when you're in an action context. In other words, you can only do it in your action function. You can't update the store. You can't go user.age equals 40 somewhere else. You can't do that. It will error. It'll be like, hey, you can't, especially
which is why we have to make setter. Yeah, that's why we make setter actions.
Yeah, that's why you'd have like user.setAge, and then that's in an action. An async function after your first await jumps out of the action context. So with a flow, it allows you to just continue that. And you can just continue to set things. It doesn't come into play very often. I actually don't use flows myself very often, if at all. And it's just because async actions do everything I need as long as I have setters. That's sort of getting deeper into the weeds. But Mazen, I know this is a feature you really love, so I'm going to let you take this one. What about views?
Yeah, views are probably the best part of MobX-State-Tree for me. Going back to your example of user and age, let's say we don't have age. Our API returns date of birth. And that could be types.date. So that's, it's a date. We know it's a date. And you have a view, and on the user profile, we want to display the user's age. You could just in your views do get, because it's a getter, user's age or whatever you want your function name to be. And then within that, just return converting the type.date.
Like do the math, calculate the age.
Exactly. Do the math.
Return it.
And then just return that age and it'll display on your screen. And every time.
And it caches it.
Exactly. It caches it.
Like it caches it and waits, like if birth date changes, it updates the getter. But otherwise, it's not recalculating it every time. It just like saves that.
That idea of the views always still listening to whatever the one thing you're using, because you kind of want to keep your views to listen to as little stuff as possible. I think we're going back to performance. If that one thing changes, it'll update just that one spot that needs to be updated, not everything kind of leading up to that. So this is like the most appealing. Well, not that the rest isn't, but I love this aspect of it. I think should be leveraged more with MobX.
I definitely found myself trying to reach for that concept while I was using Redux Toolkit.
A view. This is actually the most poorly named concept in MobX-State-Tree. A view is like a view into your data. What I would probably call it is, like computed value, derived state.
Yeah. Or
you're transforming data before you consume it. So how would you do that in Redux? Like what is the, or RTK?
I think you'd almost have to write a utility function.
Yeah.
Like you would, in your, let's say, your profile stats component, you would get the user object and then you would send it out.
And memoize it.
Yeah, you'd send it out to a utility function that memoizes it, or even within the component, just a memoized age that does that for you.
Yeah, it would be very manual.
Yeah. So going back to quote unquote boilerplate, you're just adding more to it to get the add-on views are basically utility functions. Whether
you can do some stuff with selectors, right?
You can.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
But it's not as performant.
No.
Is there, I thought that there was a computed property feature in Redux and RTK.
If there was, I don't think we've used it.
You haven't used that yet. Okay.
Yeah, it just says use selector.
Selectors, I suppose. Yeah. So I guess from my perspective, it certainly is, there's probably ways to accomplish this elsewhere, but the caching you get, and then the reactivity is kind of the biggest thing that I wanted to bring up. So with MobX React and MobX React Lite just doesn't support the class syntax for components. what you do is you just you wrap your components in an observer function. So you just say like export your observer version of this component. And then what that does is it ensures that any property that changes in any model or any store that is accessed inside of that component will actually then in a targeted way re-render that component. So if you had a little age ticker that was based on the birth date, and then someone goes in there, edits their profile and changes the birth date, it will actually update that age component, the component that is consuming that age, based on the view. It could also do it just based on bare properties that you're accessing as well, because maybe you have the birth date shown somewhere, and that also updates. But also, it's only that component. It doesn't have to re-render the whole tree because, hey, we're immutable, so now everything has changed. We have to go deep compare everything, not to get after immutable structures again. But
just real quick, with RTK, the useSelector only selects the data for you. So it's almost like if you want to get the date of birth in your view, you'd use selector state arrow state dot user dot date of DOB or whatever. So to still convert it to age, you'd still have to have a utility function that does it. But you
to
could
make that change,
you could put it within the selector still, and the const age is equal to useSelector, etc. So there's still more work to be done to get you there, instead of just having that one piece live in that one spot, and it's visible.
So the last pro I'd like to throw out there is that MobX-State-Tree doesn't change all that much, and I do see that as a pro.
It doesn't change much because Jamon's the maintainer.
It's true. I'm very careful not to make a lot of changes. A lot of people rely on this library, and I really only want to make changes where it's really necessary. With that said, it is something that this is getting into the cons. We have a smaller community. Actually, I saw the creator of Angular actually submitted a pull request to MobX-State-Tree the other day, so he's using it.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. But we have a smaller community than Redux. We're still the biggest. MobX-State-Tree and MobX itself are still the biggest alternative to Redux. So don't feel like it's small.
It's
like,
not
small.
I would
just small
characterize it
Redux.
as like a 80-20, 90-10.
Yeah, it's in that range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are apps in production that are using it. So
oh yeah, for sure. Tons.
The ones we've made for sure.
Not just that. There are some big apps out there that are using MobX-State-Tree for sure. But yeah, we obviously use it at Infinite Red a lot too. There are some gotchas. We talked about the async actions where it'll jump out of the action context once you do your first await. So that's why flow exists. But that's a relatively straightforward way to fix it. And there's some heuristics you can use to make sure that doesn't happen.
One of the biggest cons for me is there tend to be a lot more errors and like things that just don't work the way you think they're going to work. I've had a lot of issues with the identifier and reference types. So there's a feature in MobX-State-Tree where you can define a particular field as an identifier, like an ID.
Yeah.
And then that lets you reference that object or instance as its identifier. So if you have a list of that particular model type, it stores a list of its identifier instead of the entire instance. And I've had a lot of issues with like references being missing or in another tree, or like I'm not entirely sure what goes on behind the scenes, but it can be tricky to get it right. And things like deleting objects can be kind of fraught because they disappear, but then something's listening or referencing it somewhere else. You get a red screen. It gets tricky in situations where you're trying to paginate a lot of data. So you're like clearing out entire stores and replacing the data. And then you're dealing with sort of abandoned references.
Right.
There can be some bugs in that area and it can be frustrating.
References, which we didn't even touch on here until now. References are finicky in a way that I don't really like. I actually created a library to fix this.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's called MST Reference Pool. And what it does is...
When did you do this?
Oh, just on my live stream at rn.live.
in his free time.
Clearly, I didn't watch that episode.
MST Reference Pool is it's a MobX-State-Tree extension, so you can just like load it in really easily. that lets you use references to a pool of model instances for any store. So it's sort of like an array type, like a typeset array that you can point all of your references to. It also has a garbage collector, so you don't have memory leaks. So let's say you have a bunch of posts, and this is all stuff that Robin just talked about. Like this is stuff that she's dealt with. So when you add new posts, let's say you loaded in from the server or you created a new one on your app, you would use the functions that I provide to add these things. And then you can reference those anywhere in your tree. And it will basically, everything in your data tree is going to be a reference, not the original post itself. And the only time that the post is actually deleted is when all of the references are gone.
Nice.
So when there's no references left, then it will finally delete it, which is the whole problem with the, like referencing dead objects. You deleted it, but then it was referenced somewhere else and things like that. That it solves all of those issues. And it is very performant. It works super well for this stuff. I'm using it on a side app. It's great.
Nice.
So this was definitely built to kind of fix a lot of that.
Okay, we can cross that con off the list.
You can if you use this.
Jamon fixed it.
Library, yeah. The Gas Buddy app, which we've been working on for quite some time, actually uses it under the hood for a lot of stuff.
Side note, we work on the Gas Buddy app, which was #1 in the App Store a couple of times.
Yeah. And probably will continue to be very high with the gas prices the way they are. So that is a huge complaint, one of the biggest complaints about MobX-State-Tree, and I think I've mostly addressed it at this point because of that. Obviously, I mentioned the smaller core team, which kind of goes with the community. I do actually have about 15 people on the core team, but not everybody is super active. So there are people, watching the repo and things like that. I would say the documentation is one of the negatives.
It's always been its Achilles heel, I think.
Yeah. I really need to go through and pretty much redo them.
I think all documentation around the world can always improve and keep working on. I agree with you. But I think you putting it in the cons is a little bit, I kind of disagree with it because you also have the videos. Because I think the videos are very helpful of actually seeing it working. Yeah. Plus there's also, considering it's a small community, the documentation still, I keep going back to the videos. The videos are great. And I think you do a lot of, content, whether it's the Loom videos or your stream where you do go through it. And it's very helpful to kind of help with the documentation aspect. When I was learning MobX-State-Tree, I was able to find the videos on the site and actually some videos of you talking about MST. And I was able to pretty much learn and understand the basics of MST through that.
It might be a little overstating it to say that, I don't know if I even really want to. Redux needs a lot of documentation because of all the new concepts they've created. Do you really need a documentation about a function, a setter function, stuff like that? Like you do need documentation for an action and reducer. You do. Yeah. You don't need it for a setter function like as much, like you could have a little bit. With that said, I do think that the documentation of Redux is better for sure. They put more time into it. We're really way over time here. And I apologize to the editors here for this one. There's just a lot to go through. I'm going to really quickly hit a couple other things. TypeScript support could be better. The errors that TypeScript pops up are a little obtuse, and that can be problematic in a lot of ways. I wish it was better.
Yeah, it's the runtime type checking and TypeScript don't always mesh very well.
And so because of that, those are definitely some negatives. I'm going to do a really quick reminder on the pros of Redux. They're basically the opposite of the cons of MST, which is that essentially very popular, big community, lots of good documentation, integration with dev tooling. There is pretty good dev tooling for MobX-State-Tree.
I searched for a VS Code extension. It doesn't exist.
But yeah, no VS Code extension, all these things. And the errors are better, TypeScript integration's better. And those are good reasons to choose Redux and RTK for sure. With that said, do not skip over MobX-State-Tree before you make that decision. I think that a lot of people, if they experience the two, are going to make the choice of, that MobX-State-Tree is a viable solution. You, of course, use what's best for you, for your particular organization and your use case. We do prefer MobX-State-Tree at Infinite Red. We still do a lot of Redux. We still do a lot of RTK. We are not going to turn down Redux projects. We're going to continue to do that. If you use Ignite, MobX-State-Tree is built in already. So Ignite is our React Native boilerplate. You can go check that out. And if you want to see a 20-minute MobX-State-Tree demo that will blow your mind a little bit, hopefully, we're going to put the Loom video in the show notes. I apologize in advance for the quality. Maybe I'll redo it before we do this. There's some issue with Loom and the quality didn't come out quite how I wanted it to, but it's still quite watchable. You can still see everything that's happening. It's just not our normal, like, super high quality. Thanks to both of you. Sorry, we're just trying to wrap this up quick. We have much more to say on this topic. We could spend another full episode on this if we wanted to, but you can always go to rn.live to see me doing some live coding. You can see previous episodes, youtube.infinite.red. You can join our community to talk about Redux versus MobX-State-Tree, community.infinite.red. That's a Slack community. So over 2,000 React Native developers there. You can find us, Robin_Hines, me, and I'm at Jamon Holmgren. You can find Mazen at Mazen Chami. React Native Radio at React Native RDIO. Thanks to everybody who is helping out today. Producer editor Todd Worth, assistant editor, episode release coordinator Jed Bartosky, designer Justin Husky, guest coordinator Derek Greenberg. Thanks to Infinite Red. Did I hit all the points? I think I hit all the points. We're going to put some links.
No one's listening at
check
this
out the
point
show
anyway.
Everybody's like, okay, all right. I think we're done. See you later.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.